Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast that connects the past to the present. We're going to continue on our series about the history of U.S. and Chinese relations, and it's important to understand the past and tell the story of U.S. and Chinese relations in order to really understand how we got here today. And that's the whole goal. So for this episode, if you remember last week, we left off with the fall of the Qing Dynasty and the end of Imperial China. This week, we're going to continue that by talking about one of the leaders of the Republic of China, actually one of the founders, and someone who, to be honest, Jay, I've never actually studied prior to researching this episode.
Yeah. And
that just kind of goes to show the level of depth that we go into in history classes in high school and college, because I've never heard of Sun Yat-Sen. And I think it's really fascinating because this is a time, if you think about it in context, comparing the U.S. and China, where the Qing Dynasty was gone. There was no central authority at this point. And the U.S., on the other hand, was this rising power. You know, we were only 150 years old, but if you remember the episodes about the U.S. economy that we did, we are now the largest producer in the world. We have risen to the national prominence. We have growing population. We're becoming more wealthy. Our military is growing. If you were just to look on it on like a geopolitical scoreboard, the U.S. looks like everything's going right. Obviously, there were some underlying issues, but it looks like everything's going right and we're headed in the right direction. And if you were to look at China, you would say, wow, they're off the tracks, they're off the rails, things are going really poorly because, as we're going to see, after 1911 and the fall of the Qing Dynasty, it begins a period of heavy uncertainty. And it's really important to understand this because it's going to eventually lead to the forming of the Chinese Communist Party and eventually them taking power, and the seeds of that are sown here. So that is a long introduction in order to set the stage for this episode. So Jay, what are the key takeaways for today's episode?
Yeah, no, thank you, Colin. So this episode, we're going to focus on Sun Yat-Sen. He is probably the key figure in understanding how China transitioned from its last monarchical dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, to a parliamentary republic, and then to the single-party communist state that it is today. Sun Yat-Sen, interestingly, is one of the only people that's actually celebrated by both the Taiwanese, the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, and the Chinese communists. So it's interesting that he's kind of a, George Washington-esque figure to China today. On both sides, he played probably the key role, although definitely not the sole role, in overthrowing the Qing Dynasty. So, if we want to understand kind of how China got to where it's at today, we have to understand Sun Yat-Sen. And Colin, to your point, I mean, I studied history growing up, all throughout high school. College, studied history, and I don't think I ever even heard about Sun Yat-Sen. So it's like the average American probably has no idea who this guy is.
Like, I was going through the research notes and I was like, wait a second. I know everything. There was these different uprisings, the revolutions. It's like, all we hear about is the post-World War II Civil War. And like, for all we understand, it's like, it's the communists versus the nationalists, and they started fighting after World War II. That's it. Like, there's 30 years prior to that of this conflict and breakdown of China before it builds back up. So yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah. I think one reason why U.S. history textbooks kind of skip over this period is because it's complicated and very chaotic. But that's China. Like, China is complicated. It is complex. I don't know if I've read this quote before in this series, but I've referenced Romance of the Three Kingdoms several times. The books, which just for our listeners, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is one of the most popular historical fiction novels in China even today. I've had several Chinese friends tell me that every Chinese male is required to read Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's about the fall of the Han Dynasty. So think like Roman Empire times. The Han Dynasty is kind of the equivalent to the Roman Empire. It's like super foundational to Chinese culture, and it existed around the same time. It fell about 200 years prior to the Roman Empire, so like AD 200 ish. Um, Romance of the Three Kingdoms was written by a guy named Luo Guangzong. Anyway, the book starts with this: the empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. Thus it has ever been. And I like this phrase in understanding China because it's just kind of like, this is how China is. When it's been united for a long time, it has to split up. And when it's been divided a long time, it has to unite. And in 1911, when the Qing Empire fell, that was the empire long united must divide. And it begins this period of fracture that technically today still hasn't been united from the Chinese perspective. Both the Communist China and Republic of China believe that there is one China. Heck, we say that there's one China, and there's not one China right now. There's two different governments. So anyway, that is an introduction to kind of just understanding China and Sun Yat-sen. So with that, I'll get into the key takeaways for this episode, and we're going to have 4 of them. So first, Sun Yat-sen was heavily influenced by the United States, but the United States would never officially sponsor any of his revolutionary activities because the U.S. government cared more about business interests in China than it did about political reform. At face value, that might sound like critical, but as we'll go on to explain, I actually think the U.S. had good reasons for acting the way that it did towards Sun Yat-sen, but not to jump too far ahead. Second key takeaway. During the Wuchang Uprising, the U.S. would be officially neutral in 1911, but once the emperor abdicated and the Qing Dynasty stepped down, and a gentleman named Yuan Shikai took over the new republic, the U.S. would declare that new republic to be the sole legitimate authority in China. And even later, as Yuan Shikai and Sun Yat-sen had a falling out, the U.S. government would still recognize Yuan's government and not Sun Yat-sen's breakaway governments. He continued the revolution even after the fact, and the U.S. would not sponsor him, even though Sun Yat-sen was a Christian. He was very Western influenced. Yuan Shikai, not the case. Number 3, Sun Yat-sen and the U.S. would increasingly grow distant over time. Sun Yat-sen wouldn't die until the 1920s. Because the people that did sponsor him were the Soviet Union and Imperial Germany and the Japanese to a certain extent. So even though Sun Yat-sen was kind of like Americanized in a sense, he never got American sponsorship. So he went into the arms of other lovers, which were America's competitors. Right. And we didn't like that, so we never really became a fan of Sun Yat-sen. And this is why we kind of contrast the United States and our opinion on Sun Yat-sen, because, like I said before, and key takeaway number 4 is Sun Yat-sen is celebrated, like I said before, by both the Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, both the Communist Chinese and the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese call him the father of the nation, and the Communist Chinese call him the forerunner of the revolution. So this kind of helps us understand the complicated relationship between the U.S. and China writ large. by understanding what we thought about Sun Yat-sen.
So Jay, thanks for the takeaways. Let's start with Sun Yat-sen's life. Can you tell us about how he was raised, a little bit of his background, and I think that might add some context to why he was such a revolutionary.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sun Yat-sen was born in 1866. So during the Century of Humiliation, but after the Opium War, kind of in the middle of this chaos before the Boxer Rebellion. And he was born in southern China. So he was away from northern China, which is kind of like the center of Han culture. The Manchu dynasty was in Beijing, which is in northern China. So he grew up in a super poor situation in southern China. He received the standard, Confucian education. He worked some odd jobs. He even worked in the Portuguese colony of Macau, which is right next to Hong Kong and Guangzhou today. And that's kind of where he grew up. Sun Yat-sen's story really kind of begins when he was around 10 years old, I believe. He moved to Hawaii. So he had a brother that moved to Hawaii. He moved there. His brother, I think, actually started a business, and Sun Yat-sen started working for him. It was in Hawaii that he kind of became unique as opposed to just a random Chinese peasant or worker kind of doing his thing. In Hawaii, he was first exposed to Christianity, and Christianity would dominate his thinking, moving on into the future. There's an asterisk there. That's hard for our podcast audio listeners to understand. Very similar to the Taiping Rebellion, which had only ended a few years before he was born. That guy was Christian, but he kind of wasn't by American or Western definitions of Christianity, right? So Sun Yat-sen's a Christian, but he would have some fairly radical ideas, especially later on in his life that we'll get into here in a little bit. But that started in here in Hawaii. He was also exposed to like American technology and political philosophy. And he also was not just influenced by the United States, but by the British as well. The British had some schools, some religious institutions themselves in Hawaii at the time. But while Sun was in Hawaii, the United States would annex Hawaii and make it a U.S. territory. So he actually earned his citizenship.
He was kind of exposed to a little bit of American, I guess you could call imperialism right there. So, just by proxy of living in Hawaii when it got annexed.
Right. Yeah. Oh, the irony. So yeah, so this is where he kind of began thinking about, this is his teenage years, began thinking about democracy, began thinking about self-government, self-determination was a big phrase back then. And these ideas really stuck with him for the rest of his life. When he was 17, his older brother sent him back to China because his older brother, who was not a Christian, was like, "Oh no, Sun's about to convert to Christianity. We got to get him out of here." So he sent him packing.
Turns out that didn't work out. It only drove him further into the arms of Christianity, as we'll see.
That's right. Because in circumstance of all circumstance, he moved back to Guangzhou, which is literally the major Chinese city in southern China, in between Hong Kong and Macau, two Western Christian colonies here. So when Sun Yat-sen moved back, he didn't really stop. As a matter of fact, one of the first notable things was he caused a ruckus in a local village because he saw some dudes were like worshiping an idol of like the North, I think the name of the god actually literally translates to North Pole. So these guys were like worshiping this idol, and he got upset and tore down the idol, like very, new convertish, like zealous, tore down this idol, and he got kicked out and run out of this village, and he fled to Hong Kong. He had learned English when he was in Hawaii, so he fled to Hong Kong, started studying medicine, went to college. He had like taken a single semester of college in Hawaii, but started studying medicine, became a doctor in Hong Kong.
I was going to say one quick note about that is the school he went to, the Hong Kong College of Medicine for Chinese, was actually set up, in one of the previous episodes, we talked about some of the good that the missionaries had done was setting up a lot of these schools and translating documents into Chinese. And a lot of those were medical documents, and they set up medical schools. So this was actually a school that was set up by missionaries. And that's where he actually, in the University of Hong Kong, that's actually where he met Charles Robert Hager, who is a Swiss-born American missionary, and he's the one that baptized Sun Yat-Sen. It had a profound impact on his life. He's got, Charles Hager has a pretty interesting life in and of himself, but I do want to point that out, tying this back to one of the previous episodes that we did, that these American missionaries, even after the Boxer Rebellion, still had an impact, and it was a lasting impact when setting up schools, as we'll see with Sun Yat-sen's life.
Yeah, Hawaii was the beginning of his Western influences. Hong Kong, and during this time, was really when these things started becoming solidified.
The further he went from the U.S., the more Americanized he got.
Interesting. Could do a whole episode probably on that. Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking it's like the biggest American imperialism today is Hollywood. Again, oh, the irony. Yeah, so his revolutionary ideas really began to solidify in Hong Kong. It was also in this time that he began forming and joining various secret societies. One of the cool things that I learned in researching this episode is that just Chinese culture is obsessed with secret societies, and they form all the time.
He really did. It's funny, the Four Bandits. It seemed like he looked studying his life. He was in a different secret society. It was like a book club for him. He was just joining a new one.
Yeah. Well, so the Boxer Rebellion, this, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists and the Big Sword Society, they were all these different secret societies, like, that had different things. It's almost like, I don't know if your hometown in America had this, but like, we had a Lions Club, we had a Kiwanis Club, we had a Rotary Club, we had the American Legion. Like, there were like these little clubs that people would join. It's like that, but usually for China, more secretive and more angry. There would be like the Protect the Emperor Society and Restore the Qing Society and Overthrow the Qing Society. They're a little bit more angry than the Rotary Club, but we digress. Anyway, so this is where in Hong Kong, Sun Yat-sen started forming this. It wasn't the first society that he joined, but kind of the biggest one at this time was called the Revive China Society. And it would be kind of like the main outlet for Sun's revolutionary activities up until he formed a society called the United League. That would be the main thing during the 1911 uprising. But the Revive China Society had several dozen members, and it would kind of serve as a foundation for future revolutionary stuff. It was in this, as a part of the Revive China Society, that they launched their first revolution, kind of similar to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and the beer hall putsch. They, in their fervor and excitement, they tried too soon, too early, and it wasn't planned very well enough. This was called the first Guangzhou uprising. So they're right there. And it did not work out. Like, it didn't even have a chance. It did. It was a complete and utter failure. Several, like, dozen members of the Revived China Society were arrested, and were executed. Which, oh, by the way, the kind of like the Roman equivalent to the or the Chinese equivalent to the Roman crucifixion at this time, was called death by 1,000 cuts. And it was incredibly painful, where they would literally, like, that was the method of execution, where they would literally cut you 1,000 times until you died. And it would not be like, you would basically just get sliced up until you were dead. Not a fun way to die. So
No. Oof.
all these people are risking death by 1,000 cuts. So death by 1,000 cuts is called Ling Chi. And this is just a quick Wikipedia. In this form of execution, a knife was used to methodically remove portions of the body over an extended period of time, eventually resulting in death.
That doesn't sound
yes.
pleasant. So it's not.
So if you were trying to,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, it's not surprising that, if you remember last week, we talked about the Wu Chang uprising, where he was in the United States trying to gather support. Probably in the back of his mind, he's like, you know what? This thing has a good chance of going south. And
yeah.
So I kind of want to be away from here to, quote unquote, raise support.
Yeah, and keep all his limbs intact. So yeah, the first Guangzhou uprising, complete and utter failure. Some dudes were subjected to Ling Chi, death by 1,000 cuts, and but Sun Yat-sen was able to flee, and he fled to London. He was able, I'm assuming he was able to get to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong eventually made his way to the UK. And he was in London trying to raise support when the Qing government, the Qing embassy, sent some dudes to actually kidnap him. This was roughly a year late after the Guangzhou uprising, so like 1896, and Sun was arrested. This proved to be like one of the best things that ever happened to Sun Yat-sen. Because when he was arrested, it created an uproar, an international uproar, and everyone was supportive of Sun Yat-sen and anti-Qing at this point in time. You got to remember, the Brits have fought multiple wars against the Qing. And when it's like, the Qing's arresting people in our territory, does this sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, we saw in the news recently about these Chinese police stations, and they're doing all kinds of weird stuff. Which, yes, folks, that is not fake news. There are absolutely, I think they're called like security bureaus or something like that. And their sole purpose in life is to spy and to keep tabs on Chinese expats. Not you, random American, Canadian, whatever we are. It's to keep tabs on the Chinese expats, which there are tons of Chinese expats in Canada, by the way. Anyway, so this is kind of what they were doing to Sun Yat-sen in London back then, and they arrested him. And the outrage was so significant that they actually convinced the Qing government to let him go after about 12 days. They were presumably going to take him back to China and execute him, but he was let go. And the reason why this was one of the best things that happened was this was free publicity. This made Sun Yat-sen famous.
It's weird how that works. Like, he got arrested, and it created an international incident where had they not arrested him, he probably would have just been an anonymous revolutionary that never really amounted to much. But now,
right,
he has an international audience, and I hate to use this term, but like fans around the world that are now probably more willing to support him.
Yep. Yeah, I just had a random thought pop in my head. Um, but it's almost like, we struggle with fake news. We in the United States, I'm sure elsewhere, struggle with fake news. But it's like, would you ban and censor the fake news? That just gives credibility to the people who are predisposed to believe it. You know what I mean?
Well, remember
Whereas
when
if
we
you just
in the
go
information
ahead.
war episode we talk about where we're like, the cure for fake news or for false information, for fake information war is more information. So to come out and say
Yeah.
like we're going to arrest this guy and shut him up, it's like, well, hold on. The only reason you're doing that is because what he's saying is true and it damages you. Whether or not that's
Yeah.
fully accurate, the whole picture, you're right. That is the absolute. You make a martyr out of them when you do that, then
Yep.
suddenly everyone loves a martyr. It's weird to say that, but everyone does. They look to a martyr in this kind of heroic, deified sense. So now suddenly you have
Mm-hmm.
deified him because you have villainized him, and suddenly you are the bad guy, not this
Mm.
martyr. And everything he
Yeah.
said is now true because you're doing exactly what you say.
Yeah.
You are this evil, you are this corrupt government who is arresting expats, and you
Yep.
don't deserve to be supported.
He's like Edward Snowden. It doesn't matter that Snowden, in my personal opinion, Snowden took a lot of stuff out of context, right? Which this is the nature of the classified world, right? Like you have to assume that so much stuff is secret, so you probably don't have the full story. And Snowden did not have the full story. And in his activism, when he leaked all this stuff about the wicked and corrupt U.S. government, people support him. So the more the U.S. government tries to get this guy back, the more it validates what Snowden was saying in the first place. And Sun Yat-sen was the exact same.
So, Jay, bringing it back into his revolutionary actions in China, what was he doing at this point that led up to the revolution in 1911 and the Wuchang Uprising?
Yeah. So after they let him go in London, he still was like, I'm getting the heck out of here. And interestingly enough, he moved to Japan. And he spent the next 16 years using Japan as his base to basically do all kinds of revolutionary activities. He would go to different Chinese expat communities and try to raise support. Very similar to after the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, there were a ton of Russian immigrants, and they were a big threat to the early Soviet Union because they were constantly plotting to come back and um, uh, recapture the Russian Empire and kick the Bolsheviks out. Vladimir Lenin himself was an expat who was just plotting and with the help of the Germans was able to like go and overthrow the Imperial Russia. So it's like this is a thing that was very real and could be successful. So Sun Yat-sen kind of base was in Japan, and he the Japanese were very happy to help him out because their biggest enemy at that time, well, their biggest enemy was actually probably the Russians, but number two was the Qing Dynasty. So they were all too happy to help him out. And he formed like all kinds of different and joined other secret societies. Um, and that's kind of what he did. He also was trying to use the Philippines as a base, and he actually helped arm the Filipinos against the United States during this time. So it's interesting, and I think we'll talk more about this later, but it's interesting that this American citizen Christian never really got support from the United States and actively worked against U.S. interests in the Philippines at the time. So yeah, that's kind of what he was doing. We're not going to go into too much detail on the societies that he joined in Japan. There were quite a few of them. A lot of them were like early precursors to some fascist elements within Japanese society. But the big one, this is when the Tongminhui, or the United League got its start. Was there in Japan. He also helped launch several more uprisings, all unsuccessful in China itself. Uh, and as he was kind of trying to like give orders for these uprisings, and he was going around in support, he had actually it's an interesting story in and of itself that we don't have time for. He had a difficult time getting in the United States because we had the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and you could not immigrate to the United States if you were Chinese. So even though this dude was an American citizen, he was trying to reach Chinese immigrant communities to raise support in the United States. And at first in San Francisco, we didn't let him in. We're like, no access. Sorry, homie. So he had to do some wheeling and dealing, finally got access, was allowed to get in. So in 1911, he was in the United States. I think he was in Kansas City, of all places. When when he heard about the Wu Chang uprising, which we talked about. Colin gave us a great synopsis in our last episode on that. So he learned about the fall of the Qing Dynasty in a U.S. newspaper.
I really think there was an element that he was like, I don't think this is going to go well. We're going to plan it.
Probably.
We're going to set it off. And he's like, I'm going to go get support. Hey guys, I'm going to go get the money.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Yeah, it's funny you say that because at first he did not make any attempts to get back to China. He kept doing his thing in the United States, and after so many failed uprisings, he was probably like, that death by 1,000 cuts is not sounding too great. I'm going to hang out here in the beautiful U.S. of A. where there's freedom and
get some barbecue in Kansas City.
Jesus, yeah, some barbecue. Yeah. But as he, kept tabs on the situation later, he read in the newspaper that this seemingly successful uprising was going to name him as the president.
Oh God, I gotta get back.
and that's when he decided, like, oh shoot, I should probably get back. Yeah, so crazy situation. And he makes it back to China. And there was this negotiation, so on and so forth, where this is probably a good place to introduce a guy named Yuan Shikai, which we briefly mentioned in our last episode. Yuan Shikai was the leader of the Beiyang army, which was a very powerful army. Armies in China were very similar to like Roman legions. Like the armies kind of were more controlled by the general in charge of them and not necessarily the state. He was the guy in charge of the Northern Army, this Beiyang army. Yuan Shikai was, and he was a key official in the Qing government. So all the strong leadership. So we 2 episodes ago we talked about the Empress Dowager Cixi. There we go. I think that's the better way to say it. Cixi. She had died a couple years prior to this. She was like the strong authority figure in the government, and the emperor at the time was a child, a guy named Puyi, which he will become a key figure later in the Japanese controlled Manchukuo. But Yuan Shikai told Sun Yat-sen, "Hey, if I get the emperor to abdicate, will you step down as the interim president and make me the president?" And Sun Yat-sen was like, yeah, for the good of the republic, I'll do this. So Yuan Shikai goes back, gets the emperor to abdicate, and then also gets Sun Yat-sen to abdicate. So
I think it's important to note that it's very easy, well, not very easy, but it's a lot easier to get somebody to abdicate when you have the army is loyal to you and their guns are pointed at the emperor. And it's not like he kind of went in and it was like some Cato-esque speech where he convinced them through this great oratory. He was a great orator. It was, I have guns and you're going to abdicate the throne one way or another.
Yeah.
So, and I think so this precedent that's set here where he comes in and basically forces the abdication of the reigning emperor. It's going to come back later, and he's going to begin using this army more and more to say, no, I'm in charge. And it causes a lot of chaos and friction within the country. I just want to make that point that it wasn't like he didn't convince them. It was, I have guns and you're going to do this.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And not we're not going to get into too much depth here, but Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai would later have a fallen out, and Yuan Shikai would basically become a dictator, and Sun Yat-sen would try to oppose him every step
Create
of the
more
way.
revolutions.
Yeah, he would continue. You know, he was a Southern boy, a Chinese Southern boy.
You know, it is funny that even in China, there's kind of a north versus south. Not,
Yep.
it's obviously very different than the U.S. north versus south, but um, like yes, Sun Yat Sen is from southern China, and one of his whole goals after this is to try and go to march north. Like
Hmm.
Chiang Kai shek, that was what his northern expedition was. It was like, okay, we got to go capture the north. Like there is a ethnic and cultural, I guess, rivalry, but there's definitely a difference between the two.
Hmm.
And it's just funny you say that because yes, there actually very much is a difference between the two.
It's another interesting thing in just Chinese history. There's so much to unpack here. But they would move their capitals around, kind of similar to where their power base was. And Beijing was the northern capital. That's literally what Beijing means, northern capital. Uh, because you had the Manchus running the country, and that was like the biggest power base in the northern part. Well, when the Southern Republicans took over, they at first their capital was in Nanking. They did move it. So Yuan Shikai and his northern army moved their power. You know, they moved the capital back from Nanking up to Beijing. But then later, under Chiang Kai-shek, he would move it back down to Nanking because they were, Southern boys at heart. And uh, yeah. So anyway, yeah, that north south dynamic is interesting. Okay, just a couple more notes here. So interestingly, during this time, one of Sun Yat-sen's closest advisors was an American, a guy named Homer Lee. Lee spelled Lea. Uh, this this Homer bro is an interesting fella. He's a little crazy. He's kind of like this fake news Indiana Jones type guy, where he's like an adventurer, but he would just lie about it all the time about what he had done. Interesting guy. Long story short, uh, this Homer Lee guy had joined a Chinese secret society in the United States called the Red Dragon Conspirators, and they had formed this like Red Dragon plan to overthrow the Qing government. Homer had trained like 2,000 guys to in like military tactics to go over to China and participate in this overthrow, and that's how he got connected to Sun Yat-sen, was these network of secret societies. Well, him and Sun Yat-sen like hit it off, and he later, like, Homer became like one of his closest advisors, and later when Sun Yat-sen was named the interim president of the Republic of China, he was going to name Homer Lee to be the main ambassador of this new country to the United States. Like, crazy situation here. But as fate would have it, Homer Lee actually suffered a really bad stroke right around 1911, 1912, and then died in 1912. So that stuff didn't help out. But just to kind of paint the thread here, of U.S. and Chinese relations, Sun Yat-sen had an American that was a close advisor, but this dude was not. He was not a Washington insider. He had no credibility in Washington whatsoever. He was actually a really strange character. Um, but him and old Sun Yat-sen were boys, and that
They
didn't
did
work
their
out too well
best.
for. Yeah. So probably one of the last notes here, we can kind of get into why the United States gave Sun Yat-sen the cold shoulder. So, as Sun Yat-sen was being named the president of the new parliamentary republic, he attempted to get a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State, and we said no. We're like, no, don't want any part of you, because we didn't actually recognize any of this stuff, we, the United States, did not recognize the government until the emperor abdicated and Yuan Shikai was in charge. So,
Yeah, I think it's important to note there when it comes to like recognizing a country, like that is a big, like, I think people now kind of underestimate the significance of that. Like if we recognize a country, we're validating its legitimacy as a country and as a
right.
nation. And we're basically by doing that saying like we support you as a nation. So just because this uprising occurred and now you seem to be like you're going to be in power, like we're not going to just all of a sudden, unless we have a hand in it, and we're the ones that caused it, we're probably not going to proclaim you a legitimate government and recognize you until the dust settles and we kind of know for sure which way this thing is going. So Jay, and yeah, that it's kind of interesting if you look at this, why the U.S. gave him a cold shoulder. So because like the whole purpose of this series is to talk like U.S. and Chinese relations, and we know the U.S. had been involved militarily, especially in the Boxer Rebellion, by sending the U.S. Marines and other troops to support. But we kind of shifted into what was called dollar diplomacy, and that was essentially utilizing our financial strength as a first, quote unquote, first strike, or that was really our heavy leverage when it came to diplomacy. It was backed by the military. And so you always knew that the military was behind this financing, but by and large, we tried to utilize our banking system and our industrial strength to come in and make money. That was the primary focus of what we tried to do. We wanted to move into countries, specifically Latin America and Asian countries, and corner the market, so to speak, so that we would make money and we would basically move other countries out and for basically take away their ability to make money while we made all the money. So that was our primary focus, and it's important to keep that in mind because looking at the situation in the East as a whole, you had Japan and Russia who were part of the 8-nation alliance with us, who are now fighting, and the war has ended, but they're on very, very bad terms. So we're trying to placate both of those countries because we have a nominal alliance. We recognize the value of a relationship with Japan and the rising strength and our ability to make money with them. We recognize that China is basically a broken country with at this point, a dead imperial China. So it is chaos. There's all sorts of different ports, and we don't really want to get overly involved outside of a business standpoint. And actually Taft, who his Secretary of State Knox is the one that denied the meeting with Sun Yat-sen, but President Taft, he strong-armed essentially JP Morgan into funding a railroad project that I briefly mentioned last week. And it was called the Hukuang International Railway Loan, and that was where we're going to go in and we're going to build railways. It turned into the China Consortium in 1911, and then the Railway Protection Movement, where we tried to build all these railroads, and that was going to be our way to spread American influence and American powers. Like, okay, we're going to give you all these loans, we're going to build stuff, and oh, by the way, we're going to make a lot of money, and we're going to slowly diffuse American culture and influence that way. Interestingly enough, it was a total failure, and even as late as like 1983, I think, American businesses were trying to cash in on bonds from this railway loan with the Chinese government. And they're like, no, we're not going to. You made a bad
It's like
investment.
people cashing in Confederate bonds like in the 80s too. This is still good, right?
No, sir, it is not. Yeah, it's,
No.
yeah, the Chinese government was like, no, we're not doing that. But my point in saying that is that's probably, and it's slightly speculative, but that's because there's really not a lot of source material on like President Taft penning his, opining why he doesn't want to support Sun Yat-sen. It's really speculative. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we looked at the situation in China and we did not think backing him was the most financially sound decision at this time.
Right.
But we looked at Yuan Shikai and we're like, well, this is a strong man who might bring some stability. And I've said it before, but the stock market loves stability and hates volatility. So backing a strong man might be the better option here. So, and it's also interesting to note that the dollar diplomacy, I don't know if we still call it that, but like that's kind of what we do. I mean, again,
Yeah.
think
We're
Vietnam.
still doing it.
Yeah, think Vietnam. We lost the war, but there's McDonald's in the country, and they're pretty pro-Western and American. So
Yeah.
it's okay. Well, we lost the war, but still got a McDonald's in your
Yeah.
capital.
Yeah. Just Jay's opinion, I would have done the same thing. So if we want to ask, the question, should the United States have supported Sun Yat-sen? From an American perspective, no. Uh, that that might be, to say, if you're Chinese, I would imagine. I don't think we have any listeners in China and Taiwan unless you're using a VPN, uh, and we wouldn't be able to tell. But anyway, um, like from an American standpoint, it didn't make any sense at the time, uh, because yeah, you don't know. We didn't know who this person was. You can't just support the first big uh, revolutionary. And secondly, like the Qing government wasn't our enemies. The United States, this whole time was trying to play a mediating role between the Chinese and the Japanese, between the Russians and the Chinese, like between the British and the French and the Chinese. Like we were trying to maintain, we had this open door policy, which was, hey, y'all are not gonna we're not gonna support other powers carving up China. We want to keep the territorial integrity of China. Um, and like, so it doesn't make any sense to support this guy, even though he's a Christian, against a country that we're not enemies with. I think sometimes other people, um, in other countries who get frustrated with the United States for not supporting revolutions, feel this way. I So I might contradict myself here in a second. I was literally having a conversation with some Iranians the other day about why the U.S. government isn't doing more to support what's the protests that's going on in Iran right now. And I was telling them, it's like, you know, I obviously don't know, um, but my guess would be the current administration doesn't want, like, to communicate that we're enemies of Iran, even though they're communicating they're enemies to us. I digress. But just to explain where the government's come from, it's when you support a revolution, you're basically, in a sense, declaring war.
Yeah, you're
Maybe
basically
not quite
like,
that extreme,
hey,
but
your enemy is now my friend, and I'm going to support them so that
yeah,
they can beat you up. It's like, what? Yeah, you're not gonna take that kindly.
yeah. Which is okay. To give another example, why the Russians act in many of the ways they do. Vladimir Putin loves to talk about U.S. support for groups that Putin sees as enemies to Russia. He talked about was it the Orange Revolution in Ukraine
Hmm.
back when,
Or the color revolution,
uh,
or
yeah, there were, Putin saw that as being U.S. backed, which I have not seen any evidence to that effect that the United States got involved in was it in 2012? Was that the election? Something like that?
yeah,
2013
it kicked
maybe?
off protests in like 2013 and all that.
Yeah. So like, and that's one thing that Putin uses to quote why, we're not exactly why Russia's not exactly buddy buddy with the United States. So, to long story short, the question here for should the United States have supported Sun Yat-sen? I don't think so, because we weren't enemies with the Qing, and it just causes a whole lot of other problems when you. What do you think, Colin?
Uh, simply put, I look at this and I really think that, hindsight's 2020. We can look at it 110 years later and say, well, we should have backed that guy more. But it's like, well, even had we done that, had we backed this revolutionary, he's got an interesting quote. It is my idea to make capitalism create socialism in China so that these two economic forces of human evolution will work side by side in future civilization. Um, I can tell you right there that has a buzzword that many American businessmen will not appreciate.
Yeah.
So it, Put simply, I think the U.S. also looked at him from a financial and business impact, which is the number one priority with dollar diplomacy. It's like, okay, how are we going to get a return on investment here? Like, cash is king. We want money out of this. Is this the guy that we're going to get money back on? I think that you're right, that the U.S. was still taking a cautious approach to see where the dust settles. They could still exploit the Qing and make money, even if it didn't go away. And then Yuan Shikai was somebody that was like, well, it's stability. We can work with this guy. He's a strong man, but we've worked with strong men before. So I
Right.
think hindsight's 2020. It's very easy to be very critical of not supporting him. I personally, now looking back, I think we should have. It would have, if had we supported him then, we might have been able to unify the Republic of China and consolidate and
Mm.
strengthen it in this. You think about, let's look at the American Revolution. Right after right after we defeated the British at Yorktown, people forget that those years right after the revolution were a very tumultuous time. Like, we didn't have
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
Constitution didn't exist quite yet. We had the Articles
Yeah.
of Confederation. There were several rebellions that occurred in those years. And oh, by the way, there was all these other foreign countries that were kind of looking at the US like, wait a second, let's see where this goes. Because,
Mm. Mm.
like, the French definitely didn't like the British, but the French still could have come back and had said, actually, we want to take you over. The British could have come back and said, we lost at Yorktown, but they come back in the War of 1812. So it's a very,
Spanish, yeah.
the Spanish, yeah, it's a very dangerous time for a young republic. And had we backed the Chinese then, maybe they would have been able to get up on their feet, and we could have avoided another, this current situation that we're in, and we might have been dealing with a much friendlier China. But again, it's easy to say that now with all the information we have looking back. That's a very long diatribe.
No, that's good, and that's a fascinating thought experiment. If the United States would have supported and gotten more involved, would we have a united democratic Republic of China right now, as opposed to the communist Chinese taking over? I don't know.
It's impossible to say because there's so many variables. Maybe it would have happened. Who knows? The U.S. was able to get on its feet, so to speak, and defend itself. And had they, we did that. We had some foreign assistance and some luck, but
No.
maybe we could have done it anyway.
Yeah, I tend to think that the United States trying to politically influence China is like trying to extinguish the sun with a squirt gun. It's like we're dealing with a society that is complex, humongous, many times the size of ours. Their history is way longer than ours. The depth that is there is just frankly more deep
Deeper.
than the United States. Like, we, in researching for this series, I've read people that have Americans that have lived in China, and nearly all of them are like, the more I live in China, the less I understand it. So it's like, for us to say like we would have been able to successfully manipulate a political situation to prevent the communists from taking over with Mao, like, we could have tried, but it probably would have been super unlikely.
And that's another thought experiment to take a look. And maybe Taft and Pat Taft and later Wilson were just kind of like, you know what, like, this is an untenable situation. Like, we can't just get involved outside of maybe trying to finance a few things and trying to make some money. Like, we can't it's unwinnable. That, like we mentioned, after the Boxer Rebellion, all the Western powers are like, woof, we can't do this. So anyway.
Yeah. And the US's policy was actually to not get involved. We were trying to keep everybody else involved. Yeah. So just to kind of summarize what we've talked about is we really tried to focus on Sun Yat-sen, his life and his role in overthrowing the Qing government, but really kind of talk about his relationship with the United States and how the United States, or why the United States didn't support him at the time, even though he was an American citizen and a Christian. He was Chinese, but technically a U.S. citizen. So, yeah. And for our next episode, We're going to talk about kind of the power dynamics of the warlord era, how World War I impacted that. We're going to continue talking about old Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai and the dynamics between the two of them, and bringing it really through World War I, probably up until World War II. We'll introduce Chiang Kai-shek and go from there. So looking forward to it.
Jay, thanks for that. It was a great episode. Like I said in the beginning, super informative about a person that I had actually never studied before. And I'm sure that most of our Western listeners probably never have either. And we're getting into a point again where we just don't study that much of this part of Chinese and Asian history, especially as it relates to the U.S. and how we got here now. And that's the whole goal. So really excited to continue this series. I'm learning a lot. I hope you are too. And if you aren't and you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a rating on whether it's Podcast Addict, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. We do appreciate it. It helps the algorithm. As a matter of fact, looking through some old Podcast Addict reviews, some Indigo Negative left a pretty solid review and basically summarized exactly what we're trying to do. So we do appreciate that one. So thank you if you're still listening for that review. We do appreciate it. If you want to follow us on social media, Jay and I are fairly active on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at the Loins of History. You can find us. We post different facts that kind of follow along with our series that you can take a look at. So you can engage with us on social media through comments and feedback through Anchor. We definitely look at those and read them. So we do appreciate that as well. And remember that 5-star rating is always appreciated. So if you want to support us and keep this ad-free, which we all love, you can support us through Anchor or our Patreon page. Again, that's how we keep this ad-free, which is the way we want to keep it for right now. So again, thank you for listening to the Loins of History. Have a great one.